Thanks, Jenny, and welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to be speaking to you all about in this seminar on travel medicine, which has been a bit, we haven't done a lot of travel medicine in recent times, so it's nice to be back on the bike. I've been asked to speak to you about an approach to vaccine preventable diseases and travel. And there's no better place really to begin than with this, what many of us in travel medicine call the stephanogram. Robert Stephan, who's, I don't know whether he prefers to be called the grandfather or the godfather of travel medicine, but Robert has been a leading light in travel medicine for many years now. And every few years, he publishes this logarithmic scale, which is the estimated incidence per month of vaccine preventable diseases amongst non-immune people. And you can see here that there's a number of vaccine preventable diseases that have to be considered, of course, and we can see here influenza right at the top, going through a number of diseases and that are prevalent in different parts of the world, down to less common, but of course quite serious infections such as meningococcal disease, diphtheria, yellow fever, and so on. And of course, I wonder whether COVID will, on the next stephanogram, whether COVID will appear somewhere in the midst of all of these vaccine preventable diseases. Now, when it comes to vaccine preventable diseases and an approach to them in travel medicine, we tend to think of the 3 R's: routine vaccines, recommended vaccines, and required vaccines. The routine immunisation programs in different countries, and considering those vaccines that might be recommended, but based on where someone's travelling, and then particular vaccines that may be required to cross international borders. So beginning with the routine immunisations, and this is our Australian National Immunisation Program. Of course, every country has their own and each will be slightly different, but there are a number of vaccines here that it is an ideal opportunity in a travel medicine consultation to ensure that these are up to date. And we may have a child that we're dealing with who may be somewhere in amongst this schedule, depending on their age, and it's worth making sure that they are up to date with what they're meant to have had for their age. Sometimes we'll pick up that a child or a young person or adult is delayed in their vaccines, and we can catch them up. So it's an ideal opportunity to do this. The other thing that's possible is to actually accelerate some of these routine vaccines, and this is a table that gives some information about which vaccines can be accelerated and how quickly they can be given, with the minimum intervals between them and the earliest age that they can be given. In many countries, of course, these are some of the vaccines are given at these initial ages and with the minimum interval. In Australia, we happen to give them 6 to 8 weeks apart, but they could be given earlier. And if we had someone who was traveling in a short period of time, we might accelerate the routine schedule. Just to continue with some of the routine vaccines, and just to highlight the fact that hepatitis B is an important disease all around the world. And for particular groups of travellers, we might need to think about recommending hepatitis B, although a routine vaccine, there are many of our travellers who will not have had routine hepatitis B, and we may need to consider giving them a primary schedule of hepatitis B vaccine if they are travelling to an area of high risk or they are engaging in high risk travel. Diphtheria as another routine vaccine as part of the routine program in most countries in the world, but epidemic diphtheria re-emerged in the 1990s, and we've seen major outbreaks in the last 5 or 6 years in a number of countries, most notably Indonesia in 2017. So it's really important to make sure that people are up to date with diphtheria. In most countries, diphtheria vaccine is not given on its own, but given in combination with others. Sometimes it's given in combination with polio vaccine, and this is a map of global wild-type polio and vaccine-derived polio cases in the last 12 months. as of just a week or so ago. And you can see here that there are still around the world wild polio cases in Pakistan, Mozambique, Afghanistan, and Malawi. And then a number of countries where there are vaccine-derived cases, which are of importance because there is the possibility of transmission of virus from these people. Importantly, people going to countries in the Middle East and Africa where there are cases, we should make sure that they've had a booster dose. And in terms of the routine immunisations and boosters, for people going to endemic countries, it's worth the one-off polio booster, as I mentioned. It's worthwhile considering whether someone is up to date with their tetanus boosters, whether they have had diphtheria and all of the other vaccines, and considering one of the inactivated vaccines that includes diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis, and polio. We mustn't forget measles, and this speaks to the increase in cases that occurred about 3 years ago, and this, of course, is pre-COVID. There are emerging data that actually measles cases have gone up still further because of disruption to vaccine programs around the world, and measles vaccine in particular, measles, mumps, rubella vaccine in a number of countries. The rates of vaccination are lower than they have been in previous years because of disruption, because of COVID lockdowns and because of illness associated with COVID. So in this context, and here are the cases of measles in the last 6 months, and you can see that in a number of countries in Africa, Nigeria, Somalia, and in India, there have been high numbers of cases reported. And so people traveling to these countries, we should think about measles vaccine, and it's a routine vaccine, but we should consider giving a booster. Another vaccine that is maybe in the category of routine or maybe in the category of recommended is influenza vaccine. It's the most common vaccine preventable disease in travellers. We need to consider influenza vaccine, not just in the context of swine flu or bird flu, but this is an important problem in Australia right at the moment. And in Victoria, where I live, we've got an emerging influenza outbreak with a number of cases that are really swamping our hospitals, patients in hospitals being admitted and others to ICU, and there have already been some deaths. So these are the vaccines that are recommended in Australia. There are different vaccines used in different countries. The point is to make sure that people have had their influenza vaccine if they are travelling. Another vaccine that might be considered in either the routine or the recommended group is TB vaccine, BCG. Latent TB infection is right up the top of the chart in terms of vaccine preventable disease incidence as well. And these are the countries around the world where TB incidence rates are high. And really, anyone travelling to these countries who is under the age of 5 should be offered BCG vaccine. Of course, in many countries that are included amongst attendees today, BCG may well be part of the routine program given at birth. So this is more relevant for those of us in countries that don't have a BCG program, and for VFR travellers, for example, who are travelling back to the family's country of origin. So if we now come to recommended vaccines, and when we think about recommended vaccines, we have to think about a couple of things. This is another stephanogram, and Robert produces this very nice graphic that overlays the incidence of vaccine preventable diseases with their impact. And of course, there are some infections that might be very common, like hepatitis A, for example, but that may not have the impact of something like meningococcal disease. And so these things need to be taken into account, both in terms of the disease, but also to the country to which people are traveling in terms of risk exposure. We need to do an individualized risk assessment, and we've heard a bit about the travel medicine consultation, both from Jenny and from Lavina. Well, we need to think about the destination, we need to think about the host, and we need to think about exposure factors and put this into the mix to decide which vaccines we will recommend. So it takes some time, and there is some complexity, but we need to do this for our patients so that we can give them the best advice. Here's a list of host factors. As Jenny said, these slides will be available, so you don't need to note anything down or try and concentrate on all the detail. But there are a number of host factors and special risk groups we need to consider in terms of what vaccine preventable diseases might be important. And there are exposure factors that might influence the vaccine that we offer. And Karen, in her talk, will talk about some of the food and waterborne exposure factors and the impact on vaccination. There are a number of other exposure factors that might influence the vaccines that we offer. Recommended vaccines might include hepatitis A, typhoid. These are some of the common ones, of course, rabies, Japanese encephalitis, meningococcal vaccines, and there are many others. And really, I'm not going to go into any detail. This is an approach to this subject, but each of the vaccines, it will depend on the age of the patient, or the age of the traveller, their background health, other host factors, where they're travelling, for how long, and then the different vaccines that are available and which ones we may choose. And finally, if we come to required vaccines, so there are a number of vaccines that we may recommend. There are all the routine immunisations, but there are only a couple really that are absolutely required for travel. And these will be well known to all of you. Yellow fever vaccine, depending on the country, and I've got no specific detail here, but if you go to the Yellow Book, the CDC Yellow Book, or to the WHO website, there is a list, and I do have a list here of the countries with risk of yellow fever, but without any detail about which countries it is important that a person must have a certificate showing they've had yellow fever vaccination, and where it might be recommended rather than actually required. But this is one of the required vaccines for travel to many countries. And the next is meningococcal vaccination for travel to Saudi Arabia for the Hajj and Umrah. And the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia requires proof of vaccination as part of the Hajj and Umrah visa application process. If you care to go to this website, the Saudi Arabian Ministry of Hajj regularly updates the vaccine requirements on its website, and it's in a number of different languages. So if you go to that website, you will be able to appreciate which vaccines need to be given and at what times of the year. So in summary, when we think about an approach to vaccine preventable diseases in travellers, we need to think of the 3 R's: routine, recommended, and required vaccines. We need to have some idea of the incidence of vaccine preventable diseases. We need to assess the risk in the host in terms of the sort of travel and the environment to which they're traveling, the country they're going to, and then give specific advice about which vaccines may be recommended, and finally give any required vaccines. And I will hand over to the next speaker. Thank you very much for your attention.